July 27, 1944, near Saint-Lô, France. The morning began with a rumble that didn't come from the clouds. Smoke drifted low through the hedgerows, and the earth trembled under the weight of engines. Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Hale sat inside his Sherman tank, listening to the whine of the turret gears and the metallic pulse of battle. The air inside was a mixture of cordite, sweat, and oil, like a forge set ablaze. Outside, a line of American armor clawed its way toward Saint-Lô. German panzers lay hidden beyond the fields, patient as predators. Radio chatter came in bursts. Fragmented commands, half shouts, coordinates, Tiger on the left. We're hit. Reload. Reload. Hale's tank, call sign 3, had already fired 20 rounds. The loader's hands trembled, skin blistered and torn from the heat. When the next shell jammed in the breach, a single pause felt like an eternity. The Panzer's next shot slammed into a nearby Sherman, lifting it off the ground. The shockwave rattled Hale's teeth. "Faster!" Hale barked. "Get it in!" But the loader collapsed, exhaustion, maybe shock. Hale didn't wait. He shoved the man aside, grabbed a round with his bare hands, and rammed it into the breach before the metal cooled. It was suicidal. The steel still glowed, the recoil unsteady. Then came the roar. One shot, one kill. The Panzer erupted in flames and black smoke, its turret flipping skyward like a coin tossed by fate. Hale reloaded without pause. "Bobby, what are you doing?" the driver shouted. "Winning?" Hale said. By the time the smoke lifted, Hale's tank had fired 80 rounds in under 10 minutes. 11 German vehicles lay ablaze. His hands were raw, gloves melted, ears ringing with the sound of defiance. That night, when silence returned, his commanding officer said, "You broke every rule in the book." Hale just smiled. Maybe the book needs rewriting. What started as desperation became legend. The unauthorized reload that changed the calculus of tank warfare forever. Before Normandy, American tank crews carried a damning label. Too slow. The Sherman, officially M4, was described as reliable, durable, safe. To men inside it, those words meant predictable. German propaganda mocked it as the Tommy Cooker, a nickname born from watching Shermans burn in Tunisia and Sicily. Reports claimed German panzers reloaded faster, fired farther, hit harder. The men in the steel coffins knew it wasn't just rumor, it was pattern. The enemy struck first. Every U.S. gunner trained from manuals written before war's fury reached its peak. The pages demanded precision, every move controlled, every sequence logged. Wait for the turret to lock. Wait for the barrel to cool. Wait for the loader to confirm. Wait for safety. The manual didn't care. The enemy wasn't waiting, too. At American training camps, that rhythm was hammered into young crews. Discipline over instinct, safety over speed. The gunner's creed prioritized the machine, not the man. But Hale came from a different world, one of timing, not obedience. Before the war, he worked the midnight shift in a Dayton foundry, where molten metal and conveyor belts forgave no error. His hands learned rhythm as musicians learned music. Every motion had a beat. Every beat had a purpose. When he joined the 3rd Armored Division, he realized the Sherman's flaw wasn't its armor or gun. It was the pause. Seconds wasted between shells meant life or death. Attempts to argue with instructors were met with laughter. "You're not fixing a tractor here, kid," a sergeant said. "You're firing a cannon." Hale nodded, but the thought lingered. A cannon was just a machine, and machines could always be improved. In France, his theory was tested. Each battle proved the same truth. A Sherman was only as fast as its crew dared to be. While German teams fine-tuned their reloads like choreography, American gunners followed the manual, by the second, by the grave. Thus the Sherman's slow myth grew. Industrial might replaced finesse. Hale rejected that notion. He didn't see factories or blueprints. He saw men, like himself, thinking faster than the rules, making clumsy machines dance. It wasn't arrogance, it was survival. Watching a Sherman obliterated because a loader hesitated 2 seconds, Hale abandoned the manual. He began to write his own. Legends start not in offices or labs, but in smoke-filled turrets and cramped steel coffins, where one man dares to ask, "What if we don't wait?" The myth of the slow Sherman was about to be buried under 80 smoking casings and one gunner refusing to pause. Before the war, the Army treated tanks as tools, not precision weapons, mobile cannons, not predators. Crews were taught victory came from numbers, not skill. If one Sherman fell, another replaced it, and another, and another. From 1942 to 1945, American factories produced over 49,000 Shermans, a miracle of mass production unmatched by any nation. But mass production brought uniformity. Every bolt, every switch, every motion in the turret identical. Efficiency became rigidity on the battlefield. German crews, trained as artisans, knew their machines intimately, like pianists with instruments. They adapted, improvised, relied on instinct, not manuals. Hale saw this firsthand in Sicily. Captured German crews disassembled their panzers, polished parts, rebuilt gearboxes by hand. They treated tanks like living beings. Back with his unit, maintenance felt bureaucratic. Requests had to pass officers. Adjustments required approval. Slightly altered reload timing could earn a reprimand. To Hale, it was madness. "They want us to fight a war," he muttered, "but won't let us use our hands." The doctrine called it order. Hale called it paralysis. His crew hailed from Kansas, New York, Michigan. None had faced combat until France. Their Sherman, Dixie Girl, bore a scratched nameplate welded by a soldier who'd never been south of Pennsylvania. In the cramped turret, they lived like brothers, packed with sweat, grease, trust. Every sound mattered. The safety click, the traverse motor grinding, the whistle of incoming rounds. Hale's gift was recognizing patterns. He knew when the loader's hand hesitated or when the breech lagged by half a second. He memorized the sound of efficiency, that metallic rhythm that meant life. The Sherman wasn't slow. He decided it was waiting for permission, and permission wasn't coming. He began to test small changes. He timed the recoil cycle, memorized the moment before the breech fully locked, and realized there was a gap, a fraction of a second where the next shell could already be aligned. A dangerous window, yes, but a usable one. At night, in the maintenance tent, he sketched diagrams on ration boxes, tracing the motion of the loader's arm, the spin of the recoil piston, the travel of the shell. It was an obsession. By the time the Normandy campaign began, Hale's hands knew the cycle better than any engineer. His mind had built a new rhythm, shorter, tighter, relentless. But there was a problem. The manual forbade touching the breech before the cooling cycle ended. It was a safety rule meant to protect soldiers from the blast of escaping gases. Breaking it could maim or kill a crew. Still, Hale couldn't ignore what it discovered. Every battle reminded him that slow procedures cost lives. Every burned Sherman was proof that the system needed breaking. In that moment, Hale stopped being a soldier who followed orders. He became what every innovator eventually becomes, a rebel in uniform. And when the Battle of St. Lo erupted, that rebellion would finally explode into history. The morning of July 27, 1944, came with no warning, just a low rumble from the east that shook the hedge like thunder trapped beneath the soil. The push toward St. Lo had begun, and the 3rd Armored Division was in the center of it. The radio crackled with chaos. Every voice shouted the same word, "Advance!" Sherman tanks rolled forward through thick Norman farmland. The smell of wet earth mixed with burning oil. Fields that had once grown wheat now held wreckage, twisted steel, broken glass, and the quiet outlines of men. For Hale and his crew, it was just another day toasty alive. Their tank, Dixie Girl, moved along a dirt road hemmed in by tall hedges. The gunner's seat was hot enough to burn skin. Hale could hear his own heart through the engine's growl. "Enemy armor ahead!" came the call over the radio. He leaned forward, peering through the narrow slit of the gun sight. 2 panzers, maybe 3. Their turrets gleamed faintly in the morning haze. Hale adjusted his aim and whispered, "Load high explosive." "Loaded," came the reply. "Fire." The tank recoiled with a thunderous kick, the sound swallowing every thought. The shell struck near the enemy's front line. "Too short. Adjust up," Hale barked. As the loader reached for another round, the tank jolted. A shell from a panzer slammed into a Sherman ahead, tearing through the turret. Flames erupted instantly. Hale's loader froze, his face lit by the fire outside. "Move, damn it!" Hale yelled. But fear is heavier than any shell. The man's hands shook so violently he dropped the round. Hale lunged forward, grabbed the ammunition himself, and jammed it into the breech. The steel hissed against its gloves. The shell fired, slamming through the German's armor. 1 panzer vanished behind black smoke. The breech locked again, glowing, dangerous. Hale didn't stop. He grabbed another round, ignoring every safety rule drilled into him since training. His gloves were melting. His arms shook, but he kept loading. "Bobby, you're going to cook your hands off," shouted the driver. "Then I'll shoot with the stumps," Hale snapped. The next shell fired, then another, then another. The rhythm was chaos turned into instinct. Load, fire, recoil, reload. Every motion was pain, but pain was time, and time meant life. In 10 minutes, Dixie Girl had fired 80 shells. The barrel glowed faint red. Hale's arms were bleeding, but the line held. Across the field, the panzers burned, their crews scrambling through smoke that turned the dawn black. When the last target vanished, the silence was unbearable. Hale sat back, hands blistered, staring at the gun that should have failed, but didn't. He looked at his crew, the same men who once laughed at his tinkering, now staring at him like he'd just done the impossible. He had broken the rule book, but he had saved them all. That day, a whisper began to circulate through the armored divisions about the gunner who fired faster than the Germans thought possible. The man who made a tank sing like a machine gun. The brass would call it reckless. His crew would call it genius. But Hale himself said only one thing: if the rules can't save your life, break them. That was the moment the legend of the illegal reload became real. 2 days after St. Lo, Hale's hands were still bandaged, and his loader's palms were blistered to raw meat. They'd been ordered to stand down for repairs, both man and machine. The tank's barrel was warped from heat. Their coil mechanism cracked from stress. Technically, Dixie Girl was unfit for combat, but command didn't have enough working Shermans to spare. So, despite the damage, they were sent back into the line. That's how Hale's experiment, the one he hadn't told anyone about, turned into a full-scale trial by fire. The crew didn't know what he'd done, while others rested. Hale had spent hours in the maintenance tent, ignoring the medics and sketching on the side of an ammunition crate. He'd found a way to modify the recoil timing just slightly, using a filed-down bolt to let the breech cycle faster. The change was tiny, barely measurable, but it could shove almost half a second between shots. Half a second doesn't sound like much, but in tank warfare, half a second is the distance between a kill and a coffin. When dawn broke, they rolled out with the rest of the company toward the small French village of Moya. Smoke and fog made it impossible to see more than 100 yards ahead. The air smelled like diesel and damp grass, the smell of war just before it turns lethal. The first enemy shell hit 10 minutes later. It wasn't aimed at them, but close enough to rattle the hull. Hale's voice cut through the noise. "Gunner ready." "Ready?" The loader answered automatically, though his arms trembled from pain. "Then let's show them what she can do." The next few minutes felt unreal. Motion and thunder without pause. Hale fired in bursts of 3. The new recoil bolts snapping back into place faster than anyone thought possible. The sound of each blast was sharper, angrier, as if the tank itself had found a new rhythm for vengeance. His commander crouched beside the gunner's seat. blinked in disbelief. "You rigged her, didn't you?" Hale didn't answer. He just grinned, teeth white against the grime. The radio crackled. "Sherman 12, you're firing too fast." "I conserviamo." Hale ignored it. The world had narrowed to targets and timing. The recoil thudded like a heartbeat, steady and unbroken. One German half-track burst into flame, then another. Smoke mixed with the damp air, turning the field into a furnace. By the time the shooting stopped, their ammunition racks were nearly empty. The rest of the platoon had barely fired half their load. The company commander stormed over, furious. "You disobeyed direct orders, Hale. That reload pattern is illegal. You could have blown the gun." Hale pulled off his gloves, revealing hands so raw they looked flayed. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but we're still here." The officer stared, caught between anger and awe. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You just rewrote the damn manual." In the days that followed, armor crews across the division heard rumors of what Hale had done, how one mechanic-turned-gunner had turned a Sherman into something faster, meaner, deadlier. They called it the Dayton Reload. Command never officially sanctioned it, but no one tried to stop it either. Behind every whisper was the same unspoken truth. Hale's method was dangerous, but it worked. And in war, that was all that mattered. By late August 1944, the U.S. Army's advance through France was unstoppable. Paris had fallen. The Allied columns were sweeping east toward the German border. But for the men who lived inside the machines that made it happen, victory came with a price that couldn't be counted in medals or maps. For Hale, that price came due when Dixie Girl broke down outside the town of Compiègne. The recoil spring, the one he'd modified, finally failed. The gun jammed mid-fight, locking the breech open with a live round inside. For 10 long minutes, the crew sat frozen, the smell of burning cordite filling the cramped metal coffin. One wrong move, and the tank would become a furnace. Hale's loader whispered, "We're dead." Hale didn't move. He stared at the glowing metal, thinking not of death, but of the numbers, the seconds, the pressure, the speed. He'd done the math in his head 100 times, and every time it worked. But this time, the math had lied. He waited. The barrel cooled. The round didn't cook off. Somehow, they survived. That night in the repair depot, an Army inspector examined the weapon and shook his head. "Whoever did this," he said, "was either a genius or insane." Hale didn't speak up. He just stood there, grease on his face, exhaustion in his bones. He had saved lives with his trick, maybe dozens. But now, standing in the flickering light of the maintenance bay, he finally saw the cost. The Army ran on systems, not souls. You could bend a machine, maybe even a rule, but bend too far, and something or someone breaks. Over the next week, Hale's hands shook when Hettried to sleep. His crew started to notice. "You okay, Bobby?" one asked. He nodded, lying through his teeth. When the unit's mechanic came by to inspect the new recoil system, Hale watched closely. It was the same standard part, the same safe timing. It would work fine, but it would be slower. The Army had no room for heroes who didn't fit into forms. At the next staff briefing, a colonel mentioned Hale's method, not by name, but in tone. "We've seen some unconventional reloading practices. Effective? Yes. But remember, gentlemen, an army wins by discipline, not improvisation." The word stung more than any reprimand. Hale didn't want to meddle. He wanted acknowledgement that innovation mattered, that courage wasn't just charging forward, but daring to think differently. When the meeting ended, a lieutenant pulled him aside. "Between you and me," he said, "what you did out there saved our line. Just don't expect anyone to put that in writing." That night, Hale sat by the campfire, staring at his burned gloves. Around him, other crews laughed, played cards, sang, but he couldn't join in. He'd spent months fighting not just the enemy, but the system that told him thinking was dangerous. Still, deep down, he knew one thing. The war had always been fought by the men who broke the rules, the ones who looked at the impossible and said, "Let's try anyway." The next morning, Hale reassembled his gun with the standard recoil spring. He ran his hand along the barrel, still marked by scars from battle, and whispered, "Guess you've earned your rest." For the first time in months, he didn't feel like a rebel or a hero. He just felt human. And sometimes that's all a soldier ever gets to be. The next test of Hale's legend came a week later on a gray morning outside the French village of Aulnoy. Rain came down in sheets, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. The division's orders were simple: hold the bridge until reinforcements arrived. But nothing about that bridge was simple. It was the only crossing for 10 miles. A narrow span of stone with no cover and no retreat. If the Germans took it, they'd split the Allied column in two. Hale's tank, Dixie Girl, patched but breathing, was placed right at the choke point. The first sign of trouble was the sound, the whine of tank treads, far off but rising. Hale leaned out of the turret, binoculars slick with rain. "Panzers," he muttered. "Not one, not two. A column." The company commander's voice came through the radio, tight and clipped. "Hold that bridge at all costs." The loader crossed himself. Hale just nodded. "Then let's make it expensive." When the first panzer crested the hill, Hale waited. He could have fired then, but he didn't. He knew range mattered more than panic. "Steady! Steady!" Shells screamed downrange and struck dead center. The German tank exploded in a ball of flame that briefly lit the rain like daylight. "Good hit!" the commander shouted. The next two panzers fired back. Shells slammed into the road, showering dirt and rock into the air. The bridge trembled beneath them. Hale kept firing, every shot precise, mechanical. A man who turned instinct into math. Then the loader shouted, "She's jammed!" Hale's stomach dropped. Not again. Their coil lock had seized mid-cycle, trapping a live round. His heart pounded as he remembered Compiègne. The smoke, the fear, the silence after. But this time, something inside him snapped into focus. "Move," he ordered. He shoved the loader aside, grabbed his wrench, and did the unthinkable. Kicked open the recoil chamber. Live ammunition or not, sparks jumped. Metal screamed. The breech slammed forward. The tank rocked as the gun fired itself clean. When the smoke cleared, the bridge still stood. The lead panzers burned on the far side, their crews scattering. The rain turned the flames to steam. The air hissed like a living thing. When the radio crackled again, it wasn't orders. It was disbelief. Who the hell was that firing? No one answered. Hale just looked at his crew, his loader pale, his driver grinning through mud and fear, and said, "Told you she still had fight." For the next 2 hours, Dixie Girl held that bridge alone. Every German advance broke on her fire. When the reinforcements finally arrived, the road behind her was lined with smoking wrecks. Later, a major came down to the site. "Who authorized that?" he demanded. Hale shrugged. "Nobody, sir. We just didn't feel like dying." The officer looked at the wreckage, the bridge still intact, and simply said, "Then carry on." That day, Hale didn't just hold a bridge. He proved that rules could bend to courage. That sometimes survival meant trusting the man who refused to play it safe. And for the first time since the war began, he didn't feel like he was fighting alone. By September 1944, the German army was retreating, but it didn't feel like victory. The fields of northern France were littered with burned tanks and broken men. The air smelled of diesel, cordite, and rain. Hale's tank crew had seen too much, slept too little, and eaten less. The battle came at dawn near a small apple orchard outside Mons. The division had overextended, pushing too far too fast. Hale's crew was ordered to cover the flank. 5 Shermans holding an open field against whatever was left of a desperate enemy. They dug in behind a low ridge, the orchard behind them, a perfect killing ground ahead. Hale ran his hands over the turret controls, feeling every vibration like a pulse. He could sense it. Something was coming. When it came, it wasn't tanks. It was half-tracks. dozens of them packed with infantry firing as they rolled. The air turned white with tracers. Branches exploded overhead. Apples fell like stones. "Range 500, fire!" Hale shouted. The first round tore through the lead half-track, flipping it sideways. The second hit the one behind it, scattering soldiers across the field. The rest of the Shermans joined in, turning the open ground into a wall of flame and thunder. The German column hesitated, then broke apart, infantry diving for cover, trying to flank through the trees. Hale rotated the turret, firing point-blank into the orchard. Splinters and smoke filled the air. The loaders screamed, "We're down to our last shells." "Then make them count," Hale said. When the last round fired, the recoil mechanism jammed again. Smoke filled the turret. For a moment, Hale thought it was over. Then he looked out through the gun sight and saw something impossible. The German troops weren't advancing. They were falling back. The few who could still run dropped their weapons and fled. The survivors, seeing the burning half-tracks and the unbroken line of Shermans, thought they were outnumbered. They didn't know that Hale's gun was empty, his barrel cracked, his crew half-deaf. The orchard fell silent, except for the hiss of burning grass. The other tanks' radios crackled to life. "Report, Sherman 17. Hale keyed the mic. "We're still here, sir. But next time, bring more ammo." Laughter burst through the static. Not mockery, relief. When the dust settled, the orchard looked like another world. Blackened trunks, shattered branches, apples roasted on the ground like offerings. Hale stepped down from the tank, his boots sinking into mud and ash. He reached down, picked up a single apple, and took a bite. It was sour and smoky, but it tasted like life. That night, as the company gathered what was left of their strength, the commander approached Hale. "You realize you held that position with no working main gun." "Didn't have much choice," Hale said. The officer nodded slowly. "There's a difference between luck and nerve. You've got both." The praise didn't make him proud. It made him quiet because he knew the truth. Nerve was just fear that had nowhere else to go. Under the fading light, Hale sat on the hull of Dixie Girl, looking out at the orchard. The smoke drifted away. The stars came out. And for the first time in months, he let himself breathe. The war wasn't over, but tonight they'd lived through it, and that was enough. By the winter of 1944, Hale's story had spread farther than he ever expected. His improvised recoil fix, his insane stand at Alnoy, the impossible hold at the orchard, they'd become whispers past between tank crews. He was the guy who broke the manual and lived. But officially, none of it existed. His name never appeared in after-action reports. The paperwork credited unidentified field adaptations. The war machine had no space for outliers, no box to check for bravery by disobedience. Yet what Hale had done began to ripple through the ranks. Anyway, mechanics started experimenting. Loaders learned faster. Commanders quietly encouraged initiative when the brass wasn't watching. What began as one man's illegal fix became silent policy. War, after all, rewards what works. In January, Hale's division was rotated back for refit near Rams. The tanks were battered, but still rolling. Engineers came through the depot to inspect the wear. One of them, a young lieutenant with thick glasses and clean boots, stopped in front of Dixie Girl. "Who did this recoil mod?" he asked. Hale hesitated, then said, "Nobody official, sir." Lieutenant smiled. "Well, unofficially, we're redesigning it. We call it the accelerated spring. Cuts reload time by 40%. Funny how things spread." Hale felt the corner of his mouth twitch. They'd stolen his idea, scrubbed his name off it, filed it under standard improvement. And yet, for the first time, he didn't care. The point wasn't credit. The point was that it worked. That night, he sat by the fire with his crew. Snow drifted across the camp, covering the wreckage in a strange kind of peace. The loader passed him a tin cup of coffee, still steaming. "So what now?" the kid asked. "Now," Hale said. "Now we keep it together long enough to get home." For a moment, silence fell. Then the radio crackled again. Orders for the next push, the next town, the next stretch of mud. There was no rest for men like them. Before dawn, Hale climbed into his tank one more time. The engine roared to life. The vibration familiar, almost comforting. He looked down at the control, the patched cables, the welded seams, the faint smell of oil that had soaked into his skin. Everything about this machine was imperfect, but it was his. As the convoy rolled out, the sky just beginning to turn gray, Hale realized what the war had taught him. Manuals could teach you how to fight, but only experience, only failure, fear, and defiance could teach you how to survive. Somewhere behind him, the factory men were already making new tanks, faster, stronger, based on field notes they'd never see. The soldiers who followed would never know the name Bobby Hale. They wouldn't have to. He'd built something bigger than a fix. He'd built trust in improvisation. Years later, when the war was over, Hale would visit a museum in Illinois. In the corner stood a late-model Sherman marked with the exact same recoil assembly he had once been reprimanded for. The plaque beneath it read, "Improved 75mm recoil system. Introduced late 1944, field-tested modification credited to anonymous U.S. Army personnel." Hale just smiled and walked away. Sometimes the best victories aren't written down. They're welded into history. Years after the war ended, long after Europe had rebuilt and the world had moved on, Bobby Hale returned to the small town he'd left behind. The fields were quiet again. The sound of engines had been replaced by wind in the grass, and the only metal that shone was the rust on old farm tools. He'd kept no medals on his wall. The Army never officially recognized what he'd done. To them, he'd been a dependable gunner. Nothing more. But the men who'd served beside him, they remembered. They sent letters, sometimes photos of their kids, sometimes just a single line. "Your trick saved my hide." One of those notes came from a young lieutenant. He barely remembered the engineer with spectacles. "Your recoil adjustment is still standard issue," it said. They'd even assigned it a code name now, but everyone knew its origin. Hale chuckled as he read it. The old bitterness had vanished. All he felt now was appreciation and a quiet amazement that he had lived long enough to witness peace. He spent his days repairing tractors, fixing fences, and showing local children how to keep their hands steady around machines. "You can't fix what you fear," he would tell them. The phrase carried more weight than he ever elaborated. Every Sunday, he strolled to the outskirts of town where an old Sherman rested as a war memorial. The paint was peeling, the turret frozen, yet the shape was unmistakable. He'd run his hand along the cold steel and murmur, "Good girl." It wasn't Dixie Girl. That one had been dismantled years before, but it didn't matter. The essence was the same resolve, the same steel. One spring morning, he was joined by a younger man, a veteran from Korea, or maybe Vietnam. "You were in tanks?" the young man asked. Hale nodded. "What was it like?" Hale paused for a long moment before replying. "It was grimy, deafening, and terrifying. But the part they never tell you," he said, tapping the tank's hull, "is that you don't fight the war you're handed. You fight the one you craft yourself." The young man didn't grasp it. Perhaps he would someday. As Hale walked home beneath the low Texas sun, he realized that amid all the chaos, the noise, the fire, what lingered wasn't the destruction. It was the problem-solving, the cooperation, the quiet triumphs nobody noticed. A jammed gun cleared, a bridge held, a comrade saved. History might forget his name, but not his work. It lived on in the next machine, the next generation, the next instant, when someone refused to give up just because the manual dictated so. He smiled at the thought and turned toward the light. The wind at his back, the scent of oil and soil still heavy in the air. Some heroes don't exist in statues or steel. They exist in the steady hum of engines, the ones that kept moving because someone had bent the rules just enough to make them run. because someone had bent the rules just enough to make them run.